Imagine the country that invented democracy, philosophy, and the Olympics. Now, imagine that same country becoming the global symbol for economic collapse. It's a country where, just 10 years ago, people were lining up outside banks because the entire system was running out of cash. A country where the government's borrowing was so fatal it almost doomed the entire European currency. This isn't just about a bad budget. This is the story of Greece and the true cost of Europe's debt crisis. You've heard the numbers. Billions in bailouts, massive debt, and constant headlines about austerity. But what really happened to Greece? How did a modern European nation go from celebrating the euro to being on the brink of financial failure? This isn't a complex story about banking jargon. It's a surprisingly simple tragedy about lying on a national scale, followed by years of catastrophic denial. We're going to break down the 3 fundamental mistakes that allowed Greece to commit economic suicide and drag the rest of Europe into a terrifying, decade-long crisis. The problem with Greece isn't just that they borrowed too much money. Lots of countries do that. The real challenge, the massive challenge, is that Greece managed to borrow a mind-boggling amount of money, hundreds of billions, under false pretenses. They borrowed it from Germany, France, and other European countries, and they did it by hiding the truth. For years, Greece's government acted like a teenager who secretly maxes out their parents' credit card, then shreds the bills. They wanted to look like a normal, stable European country so they could join the euro, but they were already financially unstable. Once they got the euro, the party started, and it was a doomed party. Their massive debt isn't just a number. It's a fatal flaw in the design of Europe's single currency, the euro. If Greece failed, the entire Eurozone could have failed. The challenge is figuring out how one small country could hold the financial survival of an entire continent hostage. It's a story of systemic risk, and it all comes back to a handful of people in Athens making incredibly reckless choices. To understand the collapse, we need to go back to the party that started everything, the day Greece joined the euro. In the late 1990s, when the euro was being created, there were strict rules for joining. You had to prove your economy was stable and responsible, specifically under what's called the Maastricht Treaty. Your government's budget deficit, how much more you spend than you take in, couldn't be more than 3% of your GDP, and your total national debt couldn't be more than 60% of your GDP. Greece wanted in badly. Joining the euro meant instant, massive respect. It meant they could trade with Europe easily. And most importantly, they could borrow money at incredibly low interest rates, just like Germany. The problem? Greece's numbers were terrible. They were nowhere near the limits. So, what did the government do? They lied. The Greek government, working with the global bank Goldman Sachs, used complex financial tricks. It's called a currency swap to hide billions of dollars of debt off their official balance sheets. It was like moving debt from one ledger to another where auditors wouldn't look. They successfully made their numbers look great. They passed the tests, and in 2001, Greece joined the Eurozone. This was the original sin, the fatal deception that ensured the crisis was coming. Mistake 1. The Eurozone's deadly interest rate dropped. Once Greece had the euro, the floodgates opened. Before the euro, if Greece wanted to borrow money, lenders would look at their shaky finances and charge them a high interest rate, maybe 10% or 15%, as a warning. But now, because Greece was using the same currency as Germany, suddenly the markets saw Greek government bonds as being just as safe as German ones. The interest rate on Greek debt collapsed to a ridiculously low level, sometimes even below 5%. This was like giving a teenager with a gambling problem a platinum credit card with no spending limit and a 1% interest rate. The politicians immediately went on a massive spending spree. They thought they had struck gold. Massive public sector. The government hired hundreds of thousands of new employees, creating a huge, inefficient public sector. Government jobs came with high wages, generous pensions, and massive bonuses, often called the 13th and 14th month salary bonuses. It was patronage, or simply buying votes with taxpayer money. Early pensions. They lowered the retirement age to ridiculously low levels. sometimes allowing people to retire in their early 50s. This meant a tiny number of workers had to support a massive number of retirees. No tax collection. At the same time, the state was terrible at collecting taxes. Tax evasion, people hiding their money, was, and still is, a national sport. The rich weren't paying, the small businesses weren't paying, and the government simply let it happen. For almost a decade, this system ran on a mountain of cheap credit. Everything looked great on the streets of Athens, but the mountain of debt was growing bigger, higher, and more doomed every single day. Mistake 2. The global financial crisis exposes the lie. In 2008, the global financial crisis hit. This was the moment the music stopped and the lie was finally revealed. When the financial crisis happened, all the global banks and lenders started looking very closely at who they had lent money to. When they looked at Greece, they didn't just see a high level of debt. They realized the true budget deficit was completely out of control. In late 2009, a new Greek government came to power and finally admitted the truth. The official deficit was not 6%, as previously reported, but over 15% of GDP, a massive, unbelievable difference. The debt-to-GDP ratio was suddenly revealed to be over 115%. The financial markets reacted with immediate, urgent panic. Suddenly, lenders realized that those cheap Greek bonds they thought were safe were actually toxic. They weren't like German bonds at all. They stopped lending money to Greece immediately, and the interest rate the markets demanded shot up, first to 10%, then 20%, and finally an impossible 40%. This is called the spread widening, and it was a fatal signal. Greece was now locked out of the financial markets. They could not borrow money to pay their bills, pay their employees, or pay the interest on their existing loans. They were out of cash. This is the point where the crisis stopped being just a Greek problem and became a European one. Mistake 3. The threat to the euro. Why did the rest of Europe care if Greece defaulted? Well, it wasn't out of kindness. It was pure, terrifying self-preservation. Greece's debt was held by major banks in Germany and France. If Greece defaulted, meaning they just stopped paying, those German and French banks would instantly lose tens of billions of dollars. This loss could cause those massive banks to collapse. And if those huge banks collapsed, the entire European banking system would freeze up, potentially triggering a global financial crisis worse than 2008. So, the leaders of the Eurozone, Germany's Chancellor Angela Merkel and others, faced a doomed choice. Let Greece default, accept the financial nuclear bomb and the collapse of the European banking system. Bail out Greece. Hand over hundreds of billions of taxpayer money to save Greece and indirectly save their own banks. They chose the bailout. Between 2010 and 2018, Greece received 3 massive bailouts totaling over 289 billion euros, the largest financial rescue in history. But this money came with a price: austerity. Austerity is a brutal financial diet. The European Union and the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, known as the Troika, demanded that Greece radically cut spending and increase taxes. Public sector wages were cut by 25%. Pensions were cut multiple times. The retirement age was raised. The government had to sell off massive national assets, like ports and airports, to foreign buyers. The result was a humanitarian and economic disaster. The Greek economy shrank by over 25%. Unemployment hit a staggering 28%, and youth unemployment was over 50%. The streets were filled with people protesting against the fatal austerity measures, desperate to stop the painful cuts to the services they depended on. For many Greeks, this period of austerity felt worse than the initial collapse itself, confirming their deepest fears that they were being forced to pay for the mistakes of the corrupt elite. The climax: near exit from the euro. The most critical moment, the closest the euro ever came to collapse, was in 2015. The Greek people, tired of the never-ending austerity, elected a new, radical anti-austerity party called Syriza, led by a young politician named Alexis Tsipras. Their mandate was simple: stop the cuts. Tsipras went straight to Brussels and demanded a new deal, essentially saying, "We can't pay this debt. We need a massive reduction. The Eurozone leaders, primarily Germany, said, "No, you pay what you owe." The negotiations broke down. In a desperate move, Tsipras called a referendum, a national vote asking the Greek people whether they should accept the Troika's terms. The people overwhelmingly voted OXI, no. For 5 days, Greece was on the verge of leaving the euro and reverting to its old currency, the drachma. This event was called the Grexit, a terrifying possibility that would have meant chaos. If they left, they would default on their euro debt, their banks would have zero cash, and the new drachma would instantly collapse in value, wiping out everyone's remaining savings. In the end, Tsipras was forced to back down. Facing a total run on the banks and immediate fatal economic shutdown, he had to sign the third and most demanding bailout package. He accepted harsher austerity measures than the ones the Greek people had just voted to reject. It was a complete humiliation, but it saved Greece and, critically, the euro from the doomed spiral of Grexit. So, what happened to Greece, and what is the single compelling thesis that explains this decade-long tragedy? The thesis is this: the crisis wasn't caused by the euro. It was caused by the lack of honesty needed to be in the euro. The three fatal mistakes were the original lie, faking the numbers to join the euro, which gave them cheap access to a debt trap; the spending spree, using that cheap credit to fund a massive, unproductive, and inefficient public sector, which was never paid for with real tax revenue; the great denial, the Eurozone's refusal to quickly force a debt restructuring, choosing instead to risk the entire currency to save their own big banks. The tragic irony is that by entering the euro, Greece thought it was escaping its history of financial instability. But instead, it found a new, more powerful way to create a crisis that was exponentially larger. They borrowed themselves into a hole so deep that they lost control of their own economic destiny, and their decisions almost doomed the world's second-largest currency bloc. Today, Greece is still recovering, but its debt-to-GDP ratio is one of the highest in the world, and the true cost of this crisis is the lost generation of young Greeks who left the country, the painful dismantling of the welfare state, and the permanent stain on the European project. To see the next story of a catastrophic economic failure, hit subscribe now.